Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 7th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Vom Krige. The title of the paragraph is War is Never an Isolated Act. Very famous Clausewitzian concept. Now I think we should... Let's read it in German because it's relatively short, and then in English eventually. So, der Krieg ist nie ein isolierter Akt. Was den ersten Punkt betrifft, so ist jeder beiden Gegner den anderen keine abstrakte Person, auch für denjenigen Faktor im Widerstandsprodukt, der nicht auf äußere Dinge beruht, nämlich den Willen. Dieser Wille ist kein ganz Unbekanntes. Er tut sich kund für das, was er morgen sein wird, in dem, was er heute war. Der Krieg entsteht nicht urplötzlich. Seine Verbreitung ist nicht das Werk eines Augenblicks. Es kann also jeder der beiden Gegner den anderen großteils schon genommen sein und tun müsste. Nun bleibt aber der Mensch mit seiner unvollkommenen Organisation immer hinter der Linie der absolut Bestehen zurück, und so werden diese von beiden Seiten in Wirksamkeit tretenden Mängel ein ermäßigendes Prinzip. So let's read it in English. War is never an isolated act. With regard to the first point, neither of the two opponents is an abstract person to the other, not even as regards that factor in the sum of resistance which does not depend on objective things. Videlicet the will. This will is not entirely unknown quantity. It indicates what it will be tomorrow by what it is today. War does not spring up quite suddenly, it does not spread to the full in a moment. Each of the two opponents can therefore form an opinion of the other, in a great measure, from what he is and what he does, instead of judging him according to what he, strictly speaking, should be or should do. But now, man with his incomplete organization is always below the line of absolute perfection, and thus these deficiencies, having an influence on both sides, become a modifying principle. So this is also a very important paragraph in von Clausewitz's theory, as all these first ones are. And fundamentally, since the last paragraph, von Clausewitz has stopped talking just in theory, or better, he's still talking in theory, but fundamentally demonstrating certain evidence ex absurdo. So, having defined the absolute extremes of that lay within the principles of war, in theory of war, and now he is fundamentally demonstrating how these things, basically, these principles, even though underlying every real conflict, in reality, in fact, never quite are never quite fully attained, are never quite fully achieved. And von Clausewitz in this paragraph is commenting specifically what one of the first points, the first of 3 points that he had made in the previous paragraph, when starting to try to define, in fact, absurdly, what a real war should look like, or what characteristics should it have, in order for these theoretical principles to be fully attained. So, with regard to the first point, that is, war becomes a completely isolated act which arises suddenly and is in no way connected with the previous history of the combatant states, von Clausewitz deduces that war, in reality, is never an isolated act. And he explains why through this paragraph. So, we have commented, I mean, I'm naturally quoting the paragraphs that we have already read, because, you know, with von Clausewitz you need this retroactive, you know, awareness of what he said. You have to have a kind of a good memory. I have naturally the book in front of me, but it's still important because I repeat it again, as I always do in these videos. Von Clausewitz is following a logical chain. So if you miss one ring of this chain, you can't go on. So everything is related to it, and it forms this complex theory that you have to be able to follow and to go back to what you've read, because it's all developing fundamentally in it. I know it's kind of difficult to follow. As always, what I advise is always to study the Vom Krige. I mean, it's a beautiful read, of course, but you can't understand the book without studying it. I wouldn't like to complicate your ideas, because you realize that what I do now is I read the text and comment it paragraph by paragraph. So this is kind of simpler, and I realize that in the YouTube formula, making a video for each paragraph tends to make you lose on the long run the continuity of this chain, because naturally these videos are kind of long and you may not follow them step by step, but that's what you should do in theory. I naturally have now today was kind of the second time I've read in German. Usually I don't do it, but even in here I think it's still important, because you should be able to understand what the author actually expresses in his own mother tongue that is semantically different from English. I mean, as to any other language, so that certain concepts are better understood into this linguistical perspective. But it's nevertheless important never to forget that you can't take these chunks and make these videos and an isolated paragraph. In fact, war is never an isolated act, and so therefore the Clausewitzian theory is never an isolated YouTube video by Schwerpunkt, of course, and you should be able to chain them. This is the concept. And so these are not quotes. I'm trying to really build up a to explain the system, to explain the theory, and I can achieve this only going step by step in order, of course. So everybody is good at quoting things. You just make paste and copy, but complex theories cannot be expressed like that. In fact, I believe all the people have heard at least once in their life the famous phrase that war is a continuation of politics by other means, but throughout other means, but it's not really it. You have to understand why we get to the point, and this is already, by the way, this is the first book, which is fundamentally the only one that von Clausewitz has been satisfied with in terms of completeness. Fundamentally, this was a finished book, and it sets out the principles. So it's fundamental to follow it, because otherwise you can't understand everything that is said afterwards. That is kind of a bit more thematic. I mean, von Clausewitz eventually also has, even in the first book, it expresses more descriptive things fundamentally, but these first paragraphs are fundamental, because they are the paragraphs over which the whole Clausewitzian theory is grounded. So you can't just pick them individually, and you always have to bear in mind it's part of a logical chain you can't escape from. So, as we were saying, von Clausewitz now is reversing the, given that these characteristics of war he had enucleated in the previous paragraph, which he fundamentally was thinking, answering the question, let's see what war would be in reality if it really corresponded to the absolute extremes fundamentally. And this thing that the war is a completely isolated act that arises suddenly and is in no way connected to the history of the combatant states becomes essentially the exact opposite of what reality is fundamentally. And in fact, it generates this principle: war is never an isolated act. And he explains, first of all, neither of the two opponents is an abstract person to the other. Not even as regards that factor in the sum of resistance which does not depend on objective things. Widerlichkeit die will. And this is not true, in fact, not even in the sum of resistance which does not depend on objective things, that is, the will. So this phrase basically means that, not even the will, that is what we have defined previously in previous chapters, is, the most difficultly measurable aspect, factor of the combatant's resistance, fundamentally, compared to physical strength, fundamentally. Well, not even in here. This opponent is an abstract person to the other. This will, von Clausewitz goes on, this will is not an entirely unknown quantity. It indicates what it will be tomorrow by what it is today. So here, it's relatively easy to understand. I mean, you realize that when you are meeting a foe, you have some kind of idea of, you can relate even to a foe as a fellow human being, let's say, that you want to slaughter, by the way, because you have a perfect idea that this person, first of all, is reactive, has a will that is bringing, that you're trying to figure out, fundamentally, because, in fact, von Clausewitz is not saying that it's easy to assess what this person is driven by, but, in war, you fundamentally have an idea, most of the times, what your enemy is up to, at least. Or at least you know that he's up to something, and you have a broad variety of elements, of hints, fundamentally, that can bring you to understand what he would do. And this is naturally all the more evident when, let's say, there is a broader strategical situation in which, maybe you don't know what the enemy is really up to. Just yesterday was the 75th anniversary of Operation Overlord, where in that context of the actuation of D-Day, but in that context, the Germans had some kind of idea of what could happen. They had built the Atlantic Wall. They knew the Allies were up to something. They expected that this attack could take place. They fundamentally had their own idea, that they didn't quite, or at least they didn't all expect that this would occur in Normandy. They thought it would happen in Calais, etc. All the story. But fundamentally, these two foes knew each other. They knew what more or less their strengths were. If you read also, banally but not so binally, Eisenhower's speech before the launching Overlord, he was assessing German strengths, but still, for instance, the air superiority of the Allies, other elements. So even though it's difficult to quantify the enemy's will, fundamentally you know it's out there. You know what the enemy would do. Also because war games, war planning, and all this stuff are based fundamentally also by putting yourself into your enemy's shoes and saying, what would I do if I were in that situation? What would be my options? Always bear in mind that, of course, there is a fog of war that is particularly. We'll see how in Vom Clausewitz the fog of war really works, because certain people believe the fog of war is positivistically just, relative to what you don't know about the enemy. But the fog of war actually intervenes also into your own forces. But in that case, even by approximation, you can identify some major driving factors of the enemy's will that you can assess in order to respond to him. And here, and it is von Clausewitz stresses the the consequentiality, we can say, of this reasoning. It says that will is not entirely an unknown quantity, which is what we have explained now, and then it indicates what it will be tomorrow by what it is today. This is particularly important because there is this idea that all, let's say that will is fundamentally driven by these future expectations. So it's not really even something that exists by itself, abstractly there, that wants this action, but it's strongly rooted to reality, to time, to space. So it's something that you can follow on the basis of those tracks, if you also want. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, war does not spring up quite suddenly. It does not spread to the full in a moment. Each of the two opponents can therefore form an opinion of the other, in a great measure from what he is and what he does, instead of judging him according to what he, strictly speaking, should be or should do. This is a particularly important phrase. Let's start from the first part. The war does not spring up suddenly. It does not spread to the full in a moment. This is also particularly important. We have seen that, I repeat it, von Clausewitz is fundamentally overturning the first characteristics that an absolute war, we can call it in this sense, a war driven by purely military factors, so not influenced by any other element, would be. And there it says that war arises suddenly in this case, because it's as if it was pure will translated into action for this hostile intent and hostile feelings. Well, he says in here, real wars are never like this. War does not spring up quite suddenly. Here, obviously, he is putting things in relation, saying, you know, of course, a war can spring up suddenly, depending on, you know, which, you know, degrees by which standards you're judging it. World War I sprang up quite suddenly, but it was kind of foreseen. In fact, it was something that corresponded to a mechanism that fundamentally was known. There was a tension out there. It was foreseen. It was not foreseen how that war would evolve fundamentally, but everybody knew that in the short run this thing might have started from a moment to another, and that's how exactly it spread. But that moment to another is still something that took a relative amount of time, a relative amount of decisions, a relative amount of preparations, and so on. So it didn't happen suddenly. Violence doesn't spread up suddenly. More banally, since we're talking about a duel by von Clausewitz's definition, you don't just go in the street, feel an impulse to punch someone in the face for whichever reason, you do it the nanosecond afterwards. I mean, your brain gives the impulse immediately to strike in this guy's face. It doesn't happen like that. It never happens like that. Not even if you're a psychopath. You must have some kind of reason of predisposing situation. That reaction has to be triggered by a complex series of factors, fundamentally. And in fact, von Clausewitz says it does not spread, war does not spread to the full in a moment. This is also quite important. This is also kind of physical principle as well, because you have also certain limits to deliver force that lie fundamentally. You can approximate this even within your same body. I mean, just to think about, you know, warming up your muscles. For instance, in that case, would be preferable if you have to fight, because it allows you to deliver more strength, more effectively, more economically speaking. But at the same time, you have to warm up. So already this entails that there is some sort of preparation, and that this preparation is driven by reason, fundamentally. Even when you feel, so much hostility towards someone, you just think it. You can't feel your mind is kind of working out something, because you have to fundamentally identify what's the best option that you have at your disposal, and therefore act accordingly to it, and not just spread the whole thing fully. And also, in fact, but the same, there is a difficulty, in fact, to deliver this act of violence that war is in a moment. You can't fundamentally. And this obviously has to do also very much with the concept of attrition that we will see from Clausewitz at a quite even physical level, in fact. But it's really also a problem of the mind, because you have to figure out how to use this violence, and in the moment in which you are doing it, you're automatically stopping. So you can't spread it fully in that moment, because already things are kind of pushing you back, or you're trying to figure out what's the best solution. So all of a series of considerations that make you delay the use of violence, and probably even think on how to modulate it, essentially to deliver this violence gradually. That's also a very important point. We've seen it also before. I don't remember in which paragraph, that violence has to be delivered with a certain degree of graduality. That it cannot be physically, in reality, delivered at its fullest immediately. Doesn't make sense. It's impossible to achieve. And also stupid if it was possible, if you didn't consider other factors around, because that's really the point. I mean, in theory, in principle, that's what the act should do. We have seen Von Clausewitz says it explicitly, that you should deliver the maximum force as possible to keep the enemy under pressure, to knock him out immediately. But the problem is that in reality, even this opportunity is very often out of reach, if not always out of reach. So you realize here how the Clausewitzian system works. Theory and practice, and they're always chained. They are two different domains, but they're constantly intertwined. Because the first one gives you how war actually, how it works in its principle, what it should be about, if it could be an absolute extreme, if it could achieve that absolute extreme. But reality never makes you reach it. So it's not that you shouldn't, but you can't in reality, because there are other factors that intervene to control and modify the exertion of violence that you have to take into consideration. The rest of the phrase is also very, very fascinating in my opinion. Each of the two opponents can therefore form an opinion of the other, in a great measure, from what he is and what he does, instead of judging of him according to what he, strictly speaking, should be or should do. This also has some, this double explanation you can give. This, especially this thing of what your opponent should be or should do, can pertain to the realms of theory, in the sense that, of course, there are certain principles, and you know that this person cannot achieve those absolute extremes, because by definition that's what von Clausewitz tells us. In the Clausewitzian theory, we trust it, and we observe why, because von Clausewitz demonstrates it in front of our eyes, and therefore that's quite obvious, we would say, once we are acquainted with these principles. But here von Clausewitz is telling it also from a more subtle, more interesting, even anthropological point of view. That is what we know also from other branches of discipline. Just the thing about the the abandonment of the theory of homo economicus in economy, for instance. The idea that, you know, before economy was measured in thinking that people would make always perfectly convenient choices, mathematically speaking. Today, this is not a real world. That's not a real world. Humans do things that are fundamentally inconvenient, but not because just they don't think about it, which also happens, but also because they don't have the means to foresee what will happen. The time and energies it would take would practically freeze them and make them die. If you took that to an extreme, yeah, it's like reasoning in a Clausewitzian theory in the realm of economics. That's the same exact thing. So humans do things that are always kind of imperfect, that never quite correspond to the, or better, never at all correspond to what the best option would be. Namely because nobody knows what the best option is. You can't tend towards that direction. That makes what you would call, you know, a person more or less successful, in fact. But you never quite achieve perfection, because in the realm or reality, this is fundamentally impossible. This is essentially impossible. So, what is interesting here is the subjective perspective that von Clausewitz is choosing, because it says of these two opponents, the two opponents will form essentially an opinion of the one of the other. This is particularly interesting because the opinion is subjective, of course, so it's already you know, limited by itself. Secondly, you know, it can also be a large thing. Before we made these examples, even on great, very grand strategy, you know, scale, which you more or less know what the enemy options are in a broad measure. So this is not in reality. This opinion is not really so undermined. On the contrary, I believe now, aside from the sheer strengths that also may be hidden, concealed in some way, I would say that the psychological element is sometimes also the one that is kind of more evidently on the table, or at least what polarizes our attention the most. It's like when you fight against someone. Let's assume you're in a brawl. What you're doing is not looking at just how big your foe's muscles are. You're also looking at his face, at his eyes, because you want to understand what the hell he's thinking, whether he's scared. You want to look at his face, at his expression, because of that. So those are all elements that derive, in fact, from this, you know, apparently less intelligible, less accessible dimension of will, that, however, are so radically important. And you can figure out what the enemy is doing fundamentally from what he is, from what he does, rather than judging what he is doing, or what he would have to do or to be. This is kind of important because war has also this these situations in which you don't have, first of all, much evidence to figure out many things about your enemy. So by definition you can't judge him in absolute terms. You can form this subjective opinion that is based, in fact, on mostly on what he's doing. This is particularly important because naturally from what he's doing you can figure out what he is. So strictly speaking, also what his material resources are from what he is doing, and secondly what his intentions are. Because if a person is doing something, you can figure out what is in his mind. And in that moment, I would say that it's instinctively, at least, easier and more natural, I would say, to focus on what that person is on what that enemy is trying to do rather than what he could do. And this is risky because I believe that, you know, the reasonable idea is beyond, let's say, you know, in any war plan, etc. Things work like this: that you obviously look at what the enemy is doing, but you should have assessed in theory, on the base of what you can assess by evidence, what all the options of the enemy are, so that by observing eventually how he behaves, you can kind of predict fundamentally what he's up to. That's how you make a war plan. At the same time, however, von Clausewitz says that it, at least in here, and yeah, let's conclude the paragraph, because this is what he explains this now. But now, man, so a person with his incomplete organization is always below the line of absolute perfection, and thus these deficiencies, having an influence on both sides, become a modifying principle. So von Clausewitz here is not saying, you know, you should focus more on this appearance. He's simply saying this appearance is what you have most of the times as an evidence. And now he says, if there is a person who has an incomplete organization, so because of the lack of knowledge, fundamentally, for which attrition is always there by default, so you don't know what the enemy is doing, you don't fully know what the enemy is doing, the enemy doesn't fully know what you're doing. So in this sense, even your own, whoever you are, your own organization that tries to cope with this situation is always below the line of absolute perfection. And thus, these deficiencies having an influence on both sides become a modifying principle. So, this lack of absolute perfection reflects on the way you organize yourself, which is imperfect. So it's also not fully rational, but also driven by other subjective considerations. Quite importantly, there is a reciprocity into this, because if you act, you know, by this degree of imperfection, you're also the enemy is through the evidence that is acquiring on you and your action, is reacting, saying, you know, there is something that is not fully clear. Because even if this person was perfectly intelligent, he would notice that you're making a mistake in part, you're behaving in part in a way you shouldn't. And naturally, at that point, if this person was perfectly intelligent, was omniscient, he would perfectly find the best way to counter you. But in reality, this has rather a confusing effect, an attrition effect, if you want. You don't know, just to make an example, you don't know, you see the enemy doing something you wouldn't expect, for instance, that you may even think it's stupid given the information at your disposal. But that could be a trick, in fact. You may think at that point, maybe that your foe is actually making a mistake because he doesn't know something that you do, for instance. But you may wonder whether the enemy is doing something that you deem to be wrong on the basis of your evidence, then instead, based on your knowledge, then instead is right, because the enemy might know something you don't, and therefore this strikes kind of doubt
in you. And war is always like this. Is this continuous observation of the enemy that also affects the way you behave. This is particularly important because it makes you understand that there is an underlying imperfection in the way war is led, is made, and therefore there are certain factors that bring you to even to do things that are not fully that block you in some way as well. So since we started from the point that war basically does not outbreak immediately, and that even at the moment in which it happens, it never goes out at its fullest in terms of violence. Well, that's the reason, because fundamentally, at all times in war, you don't know what a portion of what the hell is going on. So you don't have even the aside from the physical means, but even from the rational interests to unleash violence, because if you don't have a full knowledge of what of where this violence is gonna fall upon, you fundamentally you make it wasted. So by consequence, this exertion of violence is limited by the degree of your ignorance, or however, even enacting it means that, probabilistically speaking, if anything, you're going to waste part of it in some way. So violence in this sense never spreads to the full, even if you wish. And therefore this imperfections become a modifying principle, according to Von Clausewitz. That is that in spite of the absolute principles of war that pertain to the world, to the domain of theory, to the realm of theory, in practice, in reality, this absolute picture is modified and is rendered a principle in turn, because it basically means that in reality this is instead how things always happen, always bearing in mind that this happens at a different degree, situation after this situation, or if you want to see it in more fluid means, that this situation changes constantly, that there is never a moment that is fundamentally equal to another. Now, von Clausewitz, as we will see in the future, deals a lot with these conceptions, because in his theory what you realize is that at all times, fundamentally, you never have the certainty, the full certainty of what is going on, and therefore you have to act upon certain measures that are certain criteria that are not they're not entirely scientific. This is quite important, and the really the cream also of Clausewitzian theory that makes you dismiss fundamentally any positivistic approach to history, to well, also to history in part, but to war in this case, because and war history, or history of war, because objectively our knowledge is always limited. For instance, our capacity of delivering violence is always limited. The problem is also determining by what this is limited. This is some of the most beautiful, this is an example that I like to throw in to make you understand the greatness of this thinker. Regarding the outcome of a battle. You may think that a battle is, once has come to an end, everything is clear. You fundamentally know what's won, what's lost, and and how many people have died, and why this happened, why this outcome came up. Von Clausewitz says we don't essentially know. I mean, most of the times we have no idea. Not much about the fact of was won, was lost, because those are kind of the macro evidences that there are out there, generally speaking. But for instance, especially the causes of the outcome, not really known. They're extremely complicated to know, and most of the times they're not known. And in military history, many people say, oh well, you know, that war was won because the battle was won because of this or that. But as a matter of fact, if you don't have an actual evidence, you know, a systemic analysis of the whole in which every part is of the system is known, you have no idea, fundamentally. You can't say whether a battle ended because, you know, the weather was bad, or, you know, that order didn't arrive, or, you know, you have, because it depends on this judgment depends on a sum of knowledge that fundamentally you can't dominate as a single mind, not even if you were in the thick of the battle. So and especially I would say if you were in the thick of the battle, because at that point you were put under an incredible stress that made you lose the plot of what is going on. And this is particularly interesting as a lesson because it makes you understand how, first of all, how war is fundamentally constrained in its exertion by this psychophysical limitations that are really absolute and are to stay, because you can never overcome them fully. You can naturally do something positive to, you know, to better the situation, but you're never essentially dispelling the fog of war at its utmost. You're not. There is always a part of your action that has to rely not on actual science or knowledge, but on some other indicators and some other hints of, and relying also on some other qualities of yours. And therefore, war is never an isolated act. We haven't stressed this very much, which is the title paragraph, but this has so many application in reality. You realize that conflict is never something that people, you know, that the states get to from a second to another. If it was so, we would behave like ants that, you know, if they had nuclear weapons, would destroy the world in like a few weeks, fundamentally. Because ants act in relatively different ways. War, humans have a pretty clear idea of what war is, and there are so many factors that concur for going at war, and as a consequence, war never happens immediately. Not even when you have such powerful weapons, for instance, that can tend, you know, to brutally accelerate the tendency towards the extreme. Think about nuclear weapons, in fact. Think about, I don't know, Able Archer. You know, many people believe that you know, the moment we got the closest to nuclear holocaust was the Cuban missiles crisis, but this is not really so. We came the closest to the nuclear holocaust in 1983. That was a case. If you don't know about Able Archer, please read about it because it's devastating, and that gives you the perfect idea that was fundamentally a war game. That that NATO didn't know the Soviets had the means to spot, fundamentally, and the Soviets instead spotted this fake missiles, fundamentally, that were being shot by NATO, and they were about to respond for real. Because NATO thought that the Soviets didn't have means of detection, and instead the Soviets were alerted, and they were one click away to push the button. fundamentally. And they didn't do it. Why? Because there was a man from the other side. So aside from the world, NATO or Soviet military systems, and you had a guy that had to push that button, and that guy had infinite motives not to push that button. So war is never an isolated act, not even in that particular context where it might have actually happened. I mean, it might have actually happened from our perspective, in the sense it was something so big that we like to approximate to the utmost use of force, but it wasn't really like that. Remember that never happens in a real war. That's what von Clausewitz tells us. Even if we wiped us all out by the use of nuclear weapons, we never quite achieved that at the fullest, in a way or in another. Because it goes beyond the actual destruction. It has to do with the excuse me, with the that would be sufficient to wipe us out, but it wouldn't be sufficient to deliver that violence at the fullest in any way, even physically speaking. Because something could go wrong, for instance, in the meanwhile, interestingly enough. So even if I don't know, let's assume during Cold War had started, some units of this or that the army would have crossed the the border between Western and Eastern Germany, and they had invaded fundamentally each other's, and so war would have not in that case occurred immediately, like the exact moment in which that Warsaw Pact soldier had set foot into Western Germany. All the nuclear weapons would have been launched. Obviously there would have been a time before that would have happened. Hours, days, weeks, we don't know, but von Clausewitz is telling us that this thing never quite came out randomly and immediately and without influence on the exertion of violence. War always comes from a context. So all those people, for instance, who are worried that we would go at nuclear war with North Korea, nobody wants. Nobody is interested. I remember where people were going nuts, even for political, ideological reasons, when they thought there would be a third world war because of what happened in the Ukraine, or what would happen with North Korea, what happened with Syria when Trump shot the Tomahawks to bomb it. That was all controlled. You can't understand war, but this is the point. Well, that's why von Clausewitz is so important, because it also clears your mind what's going on. There are, I believe, especially, and this is my consideration, especially in the West, so I put myself into there, but there are certain countries who are more or less paranoid about this. I believe, for instance, that in countries like the United States and in Russia, respectively, and not by chance, by this, there is a greater tendency, which exists surely elsewhere, everywhere in the world. I put myself on the first line, saying, it happens where I live as well. So it's not an accusation against the United States or Russia themselves, but it's the idea that there is this incumbent nuclear holocaust that can happen from a moment to another, which is something that has deeply informed the way certain peoples even look at war in itself. I believe, for instance, in the United States, there is a tendency, which is also has nothing even to do with the Cold War memories, but generally speaking, how the spiritual, moral sensitivity of the Americans was built historically through also the concurrence of several cultures, several communities, etc. That has shaped the mindset in a certain direction. In Russia, albeit in a very different way, there is something similar as a consequence, because of all the idea that fundamentally the Westerners have always tried to from the Russian perspective, it's as if all the Westerners always try to wipe out Russia in some way, that you have to be cautious of them, that it's a danger, a threat. So these are, and these opinions are echoed. I believe that here, at least in Western Europe, it's paradoxical because during the Cold War, we would have been the first ones to be wiped out. Like, if war had passed from cold to hot, Europeans would have been the first ones to be annihilated, to be burned away by a nuclear bombardment. And yet, I think in Europe, we haven't assimilated so much this phobia, like in these other two countries that were... There is a reason for this, because those were the ones who fundamentally were on the lead on the matter. So they felt very much this responsibility. That's also why responsibility is so important. Because if you deresponsabilize someone, like West Europe has been deresponsabilized in a certain perspective. Now, I don't want to get political and so on, but it's kind of a obvious evidence, you know, after World War II. The United States fundamentally took great part of the responsibilities, also the European governments, etc., in terms of this broader international politics during the Cold War, and still, you know, the United States pay much more for our for defense than and for the defense of the West, generally speaking, than what individual European countries do most of the times. So it's there are many reasons. Now, I don't want really, I'm not making a political point, I'm just making you understand how there are certain different perceptions of reality that's there are even catastrophistic. You know, the idea of the Third World War. There are people that I found very often on the internet who have this idea. We're obsessed, and they usually come from certain countries. I'm saying this happens also in here. I'm not saying it's an American or a Russian thing only, but you know, there are certain tendencies that are more evident, I believe, on certain cultural basis. They are literally obsessed by the idea that the world will be destroyed from a moment to another. This is something that started fundamentally as a paranoia during the Cold War in pacifist movements, etc. Simply, you know, read von Clausewitz, because von Clausewitz explains to you quite clearly that this is not true. That it's not because of the Americans bombing the Syrian bases with tomahawks, telling, by the way, the same Syrians and the same Russians to stay out of there, and telling them even when the missiles would hit, that would trigger World War III. World War III would not be triggered by that. And yet, it was full of people who went literally nuts because of this. Because they were freaking out. They were thinking that, you know, World War III would start. The same goes for North Korea. The same goes for the Ukraine. There were people who were genuinely thinking that in this first decade or the second decade of the 21st century, such a thing would happen, fundamentally. For what reason? And that reveals you, by the way, the ignorance on the overall international political situation. It's obvious that nobody would have gone to war for that. But still, people do not think about it because they think that violence, that war is something, in fact, is not an isolated act. That's the point. They think that war can break out immediately, suddenly, as von Clausewitz absurdly, has had thought ex absurdo. So drawing a scenario that is not real, in order to instead demonstrate that war is never an isolated act, which doesn't mean that war cannot start. Of course, as far as we don't know how things can go. I mean, our strategical analysis brought to say that fundamentally it's useless to make predictions to more than 3 months in today's world, because you know the degree of accuracy of these predictions after 3 months would be so low that it's not convenient economically to reason on that base. So, you know, World War III could start at some point. We don't know. It's likely, even in absolute terms, the more you go on in history, that such a thing may happen for some reason. But when you get certain situations like the ones we have seen, the ones I listed, for example, I think you should be informed enough to know that violence in those contexts doesn't matter how heinous it can be. I mean, how, certain very seriously wrong things happen in those contexts, but it will not lead to a war that fundamentally breaks out and will destroy the whole world in a blink of an eye. Because those are not contexts into which that could happen. There are too many interests. Nobody is interested to die for certain things, and nobody even ever went close to think about such an eventuality where such decisions of the exertion of violence are taken. I'm saying this not to make a point now. I'm sure many of you will. I know that every time you talk about such topics on the internet, there is someone who misunderstands everything. There is something I have noticed, not just from when I started Schwerpunkt in general, from just being on the internet. You know that there are always these kind of nuts who doesn't matter what you say or why you say it, they're always kind of freak out and start, I don't know, thinking you knew who said what. But the point why I recur to this example is to make understand how eager, strangely, and I think I need to think it twice in order to explain it properly, because I won't probably do it now, why so many people think that war is some sort of absolute. I mean, that war is something that you can unleash and will take over everything. Now, von Clausewitz is the first one to say that war can get out of hand, fundamentally. But under determinate circumstances that are often not met, and that often translates in, that by knowing how certain international things are going on right now, you should be able to understand that these are most evidently not the cases. There is a demonization of war, ideologically speaking, that kills the responsibility in the use of violence. Because if you feel really that war is something so terrible that you should never use, and for the rest everything is fine, you're just a fanatic. You're just a fundamentalist, an ideologue, a dangerous person, because quite likely, if you were presented with this, you're essentially stating an absolute, and therefore you're the most likely person to eventually resort to war with this kind of alleged moral system of justification, because you identify an absolute reason for doing it. War is never like this. War is an instrument. What really makes war happening is politics, and politics is influenced by an enormous amount of factors. They're extremely complex to understand, and nobody actually dominates. This is also very important to remember, that strategical analysis are something you can't do in your room with an internet access. You need entire things, departments that study intensely, and they might even go wrong, get the whole thing wrong at the end. So just to make you understand how the most important thing you should be concerned of is to learn more about war. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, because first of all, with this principle you would fundamentally accept any sort of tyranny, any sort of crime. You shouldn't even stop criminals who shoot at other people while they are doing it, because I can't use violence. And remember, here, whoever makes a distinction between war and violence is an idiot. Because war and violence are the same exact thing. Read von Clausewitz, study von Clausewitz. That's the same exact thing. Just today I was listening to a video, and now I won't get into the details, but because that also was entailing certain things, it's better I skip now. But there was a person who was trying allegedly to justify the fact that war is war and violence is kind of a different thing. No, hell no. War is violence by definition. And And these stupid justifications are stupid not because war can't be justified. In my opinion, war can be justified in determinate situation. It's the reason why, for instance, we, I don't know, certain rules of engagement, both in war or even in the police, is that, someone should be dangerous enough, potentially dangerous enough. At least now there is also kind of a sort of middle ground. It's difficult to assess, but just to make an example, the blue berets, cannot engage an enemy if that enemy hasn't shot the first shot. Now, this is a sort of extreme, an approximation, a sort of gallantry, fundamentally, to say, okay, until we are not attacked, we're not justified to attack back. So we should always use violence, in this sense, as a reaction to another form of violence or potential threat, fundamentally. The same with, with suspects when the police arrests people. Fundamentally, you can't shoot a person who is not posing a threat of death to someone else. So those are the rules of engagement that I think are followed by all the police in the world, and that's because that's how we rule. So there is something deeply moral into this, because this is basically how also our current international laws really work. Naturally, these are relatively, theoretical dispositions, because that we've seen it also in Vom Krige that, the use of violence cannot always be, you can try to frame it sometimes into certain laws and certain, I wouldn't even know how to call them, procedures or modus operandi or stuff like that, but violence is violence in its purest sense. So when you look at war, you have to think not at war like something terrible, with explosions, bombs, smoke, blood, etc. that stays somewhere that you don't have to unleash. Because kills, blood, smoke, and fire, you can find it all over society for some other reason. Cigarettes kill people. Isn't there a moral responsibility there that is equatable? Let's assume because of this acceptance of cigarettes on the market, there are 100,000 dead in a year. And just throwing a random number in there. And nobody cares. If in a bombardment, 100 people are killed, everybody goes nuts. Why? Because we're ideologicized. Because we don't understand the inherent, discrepancy of these standards. What would you prefer if you really had to choose? 100,000 people today or 100? But I would say 100. And let's assume that that bombardment had been carried out to prevent that state to sell cigarettes that would eventually kill 100,000 people that year. Would it be morally justified? Well, it is an interesting question. And the answer would be, yeah. Let's try to sort it out before, with diplomacy and so on. But if diplomacy fails, then you have violence, which is not something inherently wrong. Violence in itself is not nor moral nor immoral. This is the great lesson that von Clausewitz gives us. War in itself is nor moral nor immoral. Violence in itself is nor moral nor immoral. This is particularly important. This seems just like, now I'm throwing this just like to make the video longer, to say something more meaningful, get more video watch. But it's still, you could open endless chapters. Look at the Bible. Look at even at the Gospels. And look at how violence is analyzed, and you realize some very interesting things from this point of view. Because at the end of the day, violence, and this is the great lessons that von Clausewitz tell us, and on which he doesn't lecture us in any way, because he believes in individual freedom, in the free will, and he said in moral responsibility. Von Clausewitz never says, war, you should go to war for this reason. Von Clausewitz is not interested. Actually, the only thing he goes forward to say is the exact opposite. It says, you know, war is something so terrible that nobody that has been in it would like to do. So tendentially, the instinctive um, um, feeling towards war is surely, you know, terrible. War is terrible. War is something, but sometimes is its use is, if you don't really want to justify it, but at least it's motivating. If you're aggressed on the street and this person wants to punch you, you punch back. And at that point, von Clausewitz is not telling you, you know, whether it's right or wrong that you punch back. He's just telling you how to punch back and how the thing works. That's the greatness of von Clausewitz. We're talking about, you know, a 19th century German thing. I mean, a person who naturally was also characterized by certain beliefs, by certain moral standards, so he was colored in that sense. He was not impartial, he was not neutral. But when he writes the Vom Krige, he is telling you just how the thing works. So, going back to the example, just a second, of the of how people are obsessed by war, and they're not obsessed by, you know, how we die of cancer from 1 century because of, you know, the environmental situation in which we are, then we have something seriously wrong going on. Because we fundamentally, you realize that there are people who are seriously obsessed with something that is not real, or maybe that is real, but it's that completely lacks any perspective in the way it's evaluated. So reading this paragraph, war is never an isolated act, and reading how certain things happen makes you understand, even if it's very theoretical in nature, but it already gives you an idea of how war never breaks out for no reason. This was the great, I believe we are now in the 21st century, you know, since the 21st century, given that the thing stopped just 30 years ago, that the Cold War still highly, you know, emotionally affects our worldview. I mean, fundamentally, we are still scared by this idea. I don't know whether people, for instance, who lived in World War II, who actually saw the real destructions that unfortunately did not occur during the Cold War, if not, of course, were, you know, in those areas of the world where war passed from cold to hot in those years. But fundamentally, we're talking about Europeans now. We saw World War II in you know, in all its tragedy, because it was fought on the battlefields of Europe and then lived for, you know, decades of peace, fundamentally. Yeah, of course, one half of Europe was under the communist tyranny, but fundamentally the you know, there was no war. And I believe that people who lived in World War II, in this sense, had a completely different idea of what war was compared to their children, for instance, because their children kind of were raised with this ghost of Cold War that could materialize, could pass to hot war from a moment to another, that were living like that. Before I was stating naturally that that of course here I sense that at least in Western Europe we have a different sensitivity compared to Cold War memories. I mean, towards Cold War memories compared to the Americans, for instance, and the Russians, and even the Eastern Europeans in general. But this happens also firmly in here, and I have so many examples of that. Even my family, well, maybe not so many, but in general, that the Cold War has developed a much more ideological approach to the idea of war. I believe that who lived during World War II didn't quite arrive to demonize the idea of war like the people who lived during the Cold War as young people. Because objectively, even pacifism in its, pacifism is something extremely old in human civilization as a theory, etc. But, I'm talking about the great protests of the 60s, of the 70s, etc. Against the Vietnam War, for instance, or generally speaking, towards the Cold War as this potential. There were, of course, the Protestants themselves were not all wrong, naturally, but when it got to pacifism, well, there you get an extreme that is extremely violent. I believe that a pacifist who stated that in the 60s and 70s was not different from a totalitarian in the 30s and the 40s. Because those people were finding an extreme, an absolute extreme. So either annihilation or no use of violence of sort. These are the extremes, and the extremes are always dangerous. Von Clausewitz is a reasonable, well-thought theorist who tells you, who also been through war, knows perfectly what it is about, who tells you, straight and simple, that you can't pose these extremes, because these extremes do not pertain to reality, do not belong to reality, they do not exist into reality, because anyone who is presented with a certain situation always has in the pocket a gun, even if he or she doesn't want to use it. But it's always on the table, it's always an option, because our human nature is innerly conflictual, and you can't erase that. There is no way to do it, unless you alter your genes and you become a non-human. You can talk about that. But as humans, we can't. As humans, we are conflictual, we fight, we are violent. We are violent, and I would argue that also part of our civilization is has been triggered by violence. There are psychosociological studies that show, for instance, that the peak of male creativity is the peak also of male crime. This is pretty interesting. Obviously, corresponds also to the levels of testosterone. But this is something that even before science finding this out in 21st century, or the 20th, I don't remember, was known since the Bible. What does Cain do when he has just killed Abel? He talks to God and says, okay, I know what I've done, I'm a monster, and God doesn't punish him, fundamentally speaking. He just sends him together with the other people. What does Cain do? What does Cain do? Cain goes out in the world and becomes a smith, a builder. He builds up civilization. So that means that violence in itself is necessary. This is what any psychologist, any psychiatrist would tell you, that a person without violence has extremely serious mental health problems, because you can't do anything without violence. You need aggressivity in some measure to survive in the world, to have an opinion, to fight for your ideals, for your principles. And there is always this irrational, instinctive component that you can't eliminate. And you should have, because evolution made us, in this sense, functionally in this way. So it's a bit like A Clockwork Orange, fundamentally. That movie is fundamentally all about that. It shows that you can try, rationally speaking, to eradicate violent behaviors, but by doing so, you're essentially destroying human nature, and that human nature, with a pinch of salt, needs to be violent in a little measure, because that little measure is fundamental for the equilibrium of society, of our mental health, of our future perspectives. And I'm not saying that we will necessarily reach the top, everything will be fine and society will go well just forever. No. History teaches us very, very clearly that, and how von Clausewitz teaches us, we have read it some paragraph ago, that the means of destruction do not, go in parallel with civilization, which means that the degree of the destructiveness does not decrease with the advancement of the progress of civilization, the development of civilization. This is particularly important to notice, because it tells you that you can't get rid of violence, you can't get rid of conflict, and it's not because there are evil people who want war and bring us to war, because this is also the great myth, the great idea that, it's because of that person, that tyrant, that pure innocent people go to war. No, read von Clausewitz, it's never about that. Politics alone cannot bring to war. You need the people. There is a part of Western culture that is obsessed with the idea of tyranny, for which responsibilizes the masses. The masses have a responsibility, always. You can't say that bullshit like, it was just a soldier sent out to war because otherwise it was killed. You can use it as a motivation, but not as a moral justification. That still stays on you, and not because I judge you like this, but because that's what it actually brought to the slaughtering of millions. So, until humanity doesn't get this straight, it will always keep slaughtering millions. And it has nothing to do with the bullshit thing that history always repeated itself. History never repeated itself, not even once. And thinking that it will repeat itself means to basically being an idiot who thinks that has understood everything from history and can simply just not to repeat the past, not to make certain things happen. Certain things happen exactly because the past is never repeated, and therefore if you believe that that it's so easy to figure out the future, you just lower the guard, and these things will start happening again. There is always responsibility. This is what von Clausewitz is telling us. This is also for those imbeciles who think that von Clausewitz is just a sort of bloodthirsty warmonger, fundamentally. Von Clausewitz was nothing like that. Von Clausewitz was a person that enlisted at 12 years old in the first coalition, and died during the Polish uprising of 1830. So he spent all his life as a military man, among blood, among bullets, and he says that never, if you have never been to war, you have literally no idea what it feels like and how you can, not that you can't understand it, because there is also this theory that unless you're not a soldier who's been to war, you can't understand how war works. This is completely false. Most soldiers do not understand how war works. They have literally no idea. They know how war is on the field and how tough it is to experience it, but understanding war is as an intellectual matter, and you have to use reason, and you're not necessarily going to do it. That's the reason why there is a military hierarchy in the first place, and the normal private, the average private, fights on the field, and commander-in-chief stays on a chair because he has a very different task, and not because he's less than the soldier. On the contrary, he's a freaking more vital individual than a soldier, because from him depend the lives, in fact, of so many other people. So I'm throwing in these things, these hints, because if you don't understand these points, and this is what I'm using Schwerpunkt for, because if you don't get this point, we are screwed as a civilization. And find someone who speaks about this. Find someone who is not just a stupid, bloodthirsty warmonger, militarist, and someone that is not a stupid pacifist who doesn't understand even what war is. You have to understand what war is in both cases. You have to understand reality, not what you wish the world to be, but what the world is. Start from that. Don't believe that you're so special that, the world should be the way you wish. First, understand the world. Then maybe, when you understand how it works, try to change it a little bit for what you're worth. That's how life is. Well, I don't know what to say now without repeating myself, but I believe that the concepts are clear. And I will definitely come back on this topic, but yeah, I would like to stress now just the important. I would like, not because of me, because as I often said, I consider myself now, when discussing von Clausewitz, just a very unworthy, undeserving deliverer of his thought. So it's not that I want to shake people's conscience, or to wake them up, or whatever you want to call this, but I would have not started Schwerpunkt otherwise if I didn't have this fundamental aim. I realized that many people who watch my videos think that history or military history is something suspended in the air, in a sort of mythical past, or and this is real. This is how humans are. This is why I'm doing it. I'm not talking about the Middle Ages, for instance, I don't know, because I like medieval costumes. I don't give a damn. I like the Middle Ages because it's a phase that you can take as an example of how humans work, for instance, and what they do, and how humanity really is. That's the real thing. I am saying this also because there is such a huge amount of fanboyism, especially in all the generations at this point. I believe that there is no, fundamentally, I also dislike those beliefs for which, I don't know, people today, new generations today, are kind of worse than generations who preceded them. I don't think so, personally. Generations who preceded them are the ones who started things like world wars, who still had things like segregation, or were, regularly racist, for instance. So, were these people better? Well, some people say yeah, because they fought eventually against tyranny. They made it to win the Cold War. Yeah, of course. Throughout all history, they put an end to segregation, etc. Yeah, of course. Throughout all history, there are fundamentally, positive and negative things alike, but also this idea of decline, for which there was a sort of mythical past where everything worked. It's kind of silly. You can't reason in history like that. Human societies have always been problematic, have always been terrible. I just think that today we have the means, fundamentally, to look at history. We have the favorable condition to look at history from a kind of a more privileged position, because we are more privileged in general compared to people who came before us. For instance, I can spend hours every day talking about military history. Now, if I had been born even just one generation before, I might have not had the luxury of this time, of these means. I would have not had the internet, for instance. So just think about how much we have, and in this sense, let's make it better on the basis of what we have. And not everything is decline. When you get this impression that everything is always being worse, just know that every single generation in history has always thought the same thing. Always got this, at least, impression, this instinctive feeling. That's a biological thing, that's an evolutionary thing. We are programmed to reason like that, because we're programmed for the sake of our species' survival as social beings, to erase the bad memories of the past, and therefore looking at the past as something desirable for the good things, and to depreciate what we have now in order to put ourselves constantly under psychological pressure in order to improve, because otherwise we would simply die out. We would idle, we would stop working, we wouldn't do anything. This is what this pessimism is what ensures our progress, fundamentally. So it's normal, but this is an instinct. At a rational level, we have enough understanding and even amount of knowledge through history, for instance, to understand that evidently today we live much better than we ever lived before. Even if we should be cautious by understanding what is better or worse in the sense of our in the sense of nature. Does nature have a sense? Is there kind of a progress? Is it just a subjective perspective? Because science would suggest otherwise. Therefore, we need a morality, we need a purpose, we need a commitment, and that's equally important, because naturally it's a way to make us live better, but we ultimately don't know how it will be in the end. Read. I can't tell you much. I want to tell you just read, because that's the only way you can make it to accomplish something in life. Aside from, obviously reading is not everything, but reading is a fast accelerator. If you're aware of what your options are, you can work them better out. You also need action. You also need aggressivity. You also need violence sometimes. And violence is not just, punching someone or killing someone. No, violence is the ability of projecting yourself through obstacles. You need that as well. So read Von Clausewitz, which is even better. Read whatever you like, do whatever you like, go out with your girlfriend, with your boyfriend, do sports, do whatever you like, but also read Von Clausewitz, because Von Clausewitz is not really it's not telling you his opinion. Sometimes he does, describing you how war is in first person, for instance, but not quite. Even through personal experience, he's telling you the truth fundamentally. He's telling you how things are for how they really are. But just read him. Doesn't matter if you're interested about war or not. For instance, I'm kind of disappointed that seemingly there are a few women listening to me. So Von Clausewitz is for everybody. Even if you know nothing about history, this is particularly interesting. Of course, the same Von Clausewitz tells you to study history, and particularly military history, if you want to understand his theory, because that's we will get to that point. But do not underestimate his message. Von Clausewitz is not just a weird name among others that philosophers / writers, etc. Von Clausewitz is much different. It's a kind of a scientific text. It's as if you read a book of physics, fundamentally, with the only difference that, naturally, social sciences are kind of different, and yet Von Clausewitz gets it right fundamentally with the instruments of the discipline. So this is particularly important to understand, because if you approach Von Clausewitz just by saying, this is just another guy, I know better, you're just wrong. There is nothing, fundamentally good that you're doing for yourself at that point by reasoning in that fashion. And okay, so for now, today I wanted to vent a bit, and it was fine because I introduced certain topics and certain ideas that are fundamentally important for even for understanding what we're telling now. What I like of Von Clausewitz is that from these ideas you can draw fundamentally so many considerations. You can state so many examples. You can really widen your horizons. And the coolest thing, even if you think about it, is that you can always apply Clausewitzian theory to reality. It's never isolated, in fact. It's always real. You can always find confirmation for it in reality. And it's cool because it's always confirmed. That's the real point. It's not an opinion that works like, 70-80% of the time. It really works all the time. And the coolest thing is you have to figure that out. So you know it's like that, but you have to measure it. That's the fundamentally the differentiation that you find in you know the deviation that you know, I don't know even how to say that. However, the different domains of theory and practice that always go hand in hand in Clausewitz in theory. So be mindful of that. Okay, so for now I just silence myself, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.